My name is Sarah Caldwell, and I am 29 years old. 6 days ago, my sister-in-law stood on the marble steps of the historic church in downtown Boston, flanked by 2 security guards, and looked me dead in the eye. "You have no legal right to be here, Sarah," she whispered, her voice carrying that sharp, aristocratic clip she used to dismiss waiters and store clerks. "The marriage was practically over, the paperwork is moving, and this family is moving on. You are no longer a Caldwell." I stood on that wet pavement in my black wool coat, my fingers curled tightly around a heavy, tarnished silver key in my pocket, watching my late husband's family line up for the cameras. They thought they had successfully erased me from the script. But yesterday morning, a probate judge broke the red wax seal on a document my husband had filed quietly 3 weeks before his heart gave out. When the court unsealed his final will, the dynamic instantly flipped. My sister-in-law turned the color of wet chalk, her expensive silk scarf trembling against her throat as she realized the massive real estate empire she had already begun listing for sale didn't belong to her family anymore. It belonged entirely to the woman she had just locked out in the rain. Before we get into this, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story truly resonates with you, and drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to know where you are right now. Now, let me take you back to the spring of 2022, to a small, drafty art restoration studio on Tremont Street, and the first time Julian Caldwell ever looked at me like I was the only person in a crowded room. The Caldwells were old money Boston, the kind of family whose names were etched into the brickwork of Ivy League libraries and cast in bronze on museum donor walls. My late husband, Julian, was the youngest son of Arthur Caldwell, a real estate mogul who had built Caldwell Holdings into a sprawling $45 million empire across New England. Julian didn't want the boardrooms. He was a preservationist, a quiet man who spent his days in denim shirts and work boots, restoring historic timber frames and buying up old, neglected buildings not to demolish them, but to bring them back to life. I was a preservation technician, working for a small nonprofit when I met him. I grew up in a middle-class home in Worcester. My dad fixed small appliances in our garage. My mom taught 2nd grade. They valued 2 things above all else: structural honesty and keeping your word. When Julian walked into my studio holding a piece of hand-carved 18th century molding, looking for advice on how to stabilize the rot without stripping the original patina, we talked for 4 hours. He didn't check his phone once. He didn't mention his family name. He just listened to me explain how wood remembers the weather it survived, his dark eyes focused entirely on my hands. We were married 14 months later in a quiet civil ceremony by the water. No country clubs, no press, no 300-guest ballroom, just Julian, me, and my parents. But if Julian was the timber that held our life together, his older sister, Victoria Caldwell, was the steel wire designed to pull it apart. Victoria was 36, immaculate, and possessed the kind of boardroom authority that she wore like an expensive perfume. She ran the commercial acquisition arm of Caldwell Holdings with a calculated precision that left no room for sentimentality. To Victoria, buildings weren't history. They were rentable square feet. And to Victoria, I wasn't a sister-in-law. I was an administrative error. The first time I met her was at the annual Caldwell Thanksgiving dinner in Brookline. The house was an estate, all polished mahogany and crystal chandeliers. I wore a simple black dress I had tailored myself. Victoria wore designer silk and emeralds the size of cough drops. When Julian introduced me, Victoria didn't shake my hand. She looked me up and down, adjusted her gold CARTIER bracelet, and said, "A preservation tech. How sweet, Julian. It's nice that you've found someone who enjoys your little hobby projects." During dinner, my father-in-law, Arthur, sat at the head of the long table, his voice carrying that heavy structural weight that made everyone else sit up SDRAIGHTER. He spent 20 minutes discussing Victoria's latest commercial development in the Seaport District, a $12 million steel and glass tower. The family clinked their crystal glasses. They toasted to the future of Caldwell Holdings. Then Arthur's gaze drifted down the table to Julian and me. The warmth in his voice instantly evaporated. "And Julian," he paused, clearing his throat, "still spending your allowance on those crumbling brick heaps in the North End, I assume." A few cousins chuckled. Soft, uncomfortable laughs. The kind people make when they're checking to see if the boss is smiling. Julian didn't flinch. He just reached under the table, found my hand, and squeezed my fingers tightly. His grip was warm, rough from sandpaper and timber grease, and it anchored me to the chair. Julian looked directly at his father and said, "Those brick heaps have outlasted 3 generations of our family, Dad. If we don't fix the joists, the history falls down." Victoria smiled, but it was the kind of smile that stopped strictly at the mouth. "History doesn't pay the property taxes, Julian," she said smoothly, taking a slow sip of her wine. "At some point, you have to realize that some structures are just meant to be cleared away for something more valuable." I know now that dinner wasn't just casual cruelty. It was a rehearsal. Victoria was testing the load-bearing capacity of our marriage. She wanted to see how much weight she could place on the Worcester girl before the foundation cracked. 3 years passed, and Julian and I built a life brick by brick, entirely outside the Caldwell shadow. We bought a neglected 1890s brownstone in Charlestown that had a leaky roof, uneven floors, and a front door that didn't latch right. Julian sanded the pine floors by hand because the rental machine left gouges he didn't like. I rebuilt the transom window above the entry, sourcing historical glass that turned the morning sun into liquid gold across our kitchen table. We had a golden retriever named Timber who slept under my drafting desk, and for 3 years we were happy. But Julian's health started declining in the winter of 2025. It started with a persistent cough, then fatigue, then a diagnosis that made the room tilt slightly. A progressive cardiomyopathy. The doctors were honest. He needed a transplant, but his body was weak. The moment the diagnosis became public within the family, the architecture of deception began. Victoria started showing up at our house unannounced, always carrying manila folders and a laptop open to estate listings. She would bypass me entirely, walking straight into Julian's study where he sat with his oxygen tank, her heels clicking aggressively on the floors he had sanded. "We need to consolidate the assets, Julian," I heard her say through the door one rainy Tuesday afternoon while I was making tea in the kitchen. Her voice was syrup. "Dad is getting older, your health is a priority, and having these smaller properties tied up in your personal name makes the corporate tax structure incredibly complicated. We should transfer the titles back to Caldwell Holdings. We'll handle the maintenance, we'll pay off the remaining debt, and Sarah won't have to worry about property management if things get difficult." Julian didn't sign anything. He knew his sister. He knew that to Victoria, a transfer of title wasn't protection. It was an eviction notice with a polite font. One evening, 3 weeks before his heart finally failed, Julian called me into his study. The room smelled of old paper, linseed oil, and the eucalyptus ointment I rubbed on his chest when the breathing got tight. He was sitting at his oak desk, holding a heavy, tarnished silver key. "Sarah," he said, his voice lower and hoarser than it used to be, but his eyes held something fierce. "My family reads people like contracts. They look for the clauses they can exploit. But you read people like architecture. You see how the pieces connect, and you know what's real." He pressed the silver key into my palm. It was the key to the iron lockbox hidden beneath the floorboards of our Charlestown attic, right under the structural beam we had reinforced together. "There is a document inside that box," Julian whispered, his long, thin fingers wrapping around mine. "I filed it with a probate attorney outside the city 3 days ago. Victoria thinks she has mapped out the timeline. She thinks that because our marriage license was held up in a corporate trust dispute with the family lawyers last year, you have no legal footing. But she doesn't know about this document. When the time comes, when she shows you exactly who she is, you take this key to the court." I wanted to ask him what it meant, why he was talking about courts, why his family was hunting us. But he changed the subject, asking about the weather, about Timber's vet appointment, about the color we should paint the spare bedroom in the spring. 3 weeks later, on a bitter Thursday morning in June, Julian went to sleep and didn't wake up. I held his hand in the dark until it went cold. No one from Brookline was at his bedside. The only sound in the room was the steady, rhythmic thump of Timber's tail against the pine floor, waiting for a walk that wouldn't happen. The funeral was scheduled for the following Tuesday at the Caldwell family's historic church in the center of Boston. I spent 4 days in a fog of grief, organizing his suits, washing his favorite denim shirts, trying to process the massive, hollow space between my ribs where a life used to be. At 8:00 a.m. on the morning of the memorial service, my phone lit up with a text from an unknown number. It was a PDF document. I opened it with trembling fingers. It was a formal corporate notice from Caldwell Holdings, signed by Victoria Caldwell as managing director. Subject: restructuring of personal asset occupancy. Dear Ms. Caldwell, please be advised that the property located at 42 Maple Ridge Court, Charlestown, is registered under a corporate subsidiary of Caldwell Holdings. Following the passing of Julian Caldwell, the residential license has expired. You are required to vacate the premises within 14 business days. HR and legal counsel will contact you regarding relocation options. I stared at the screen. The letters swam and rearranged themselves, but the devastating message stayed the same. My husband had been dead for 4 days, and his sister was already evicting me from the house he had sanded with his own hands. But that wasn't the final blow. When I arrived at the church at 10:45 a.m., 15 minutes before the service was set to begin, the marble steps were lined with flowers, photographers, and extended family members in designer black. I walked up the steps, my head down, my breath catching in my throat as I saw the massive portrait of Julian near the heavy oak doors. Before I could reach the threshold, a slim figure stepped into my path, Victoria. She looked immaculate, her silver blonde hair pinned up perfectly, her face a mask of dignified, performative sorrow. Behind her stood 2 large men in dark suits with earpieces, security guards. "Sarah," Victoria said, her voice dropping to that quiet, controlled register that was technically private but perfectly calculated to carry to the nearby reporters. She didn't offer a hand. She didn't look at my tear-stained face. "I think it's best if you don't come inside." I froze. The world seemed to stop humming. "What do you mean, Victoria? This is Julian's service. I am his wife." "Legally," Victoria allowed a small, cold smile to flicker across her lips. She adjusted her Cartier bracelet. "The corporate trust dispute from last year means the marriage asset integration was never finalized by the family firm. As far as Caldwell Holdings and the estate are concerned, you are a guest whose license has been revoked. You have no legal right to be here, Sarah. The marriage was practically over, the paperwork is moving, and this family is moving on. You are no longer a Caldwell." She gestured slightly with her hand. The 2 security guards stepped forward, forming a solid, physical wall between me and the church doors. "Try not to draw attention to yourself on the way out," Victoria whispered, leaning closer, her expensive perfume overwhelming the scent of the rain. "Tonight is about honoring Julian's legacy, the family legacy. Whatever middle-class resentment you think you're entitled to, keep it on the pavement. Don't embarrass us." She turned around and walked through the heavy oak doors, flanked by her cousins. The doors closed with a heavy, definitive thud that echoed down the street. I stood on the wet marble steps alone. 300 people were inside celebrating my husband's life, and his family had just left me in the rain like a trespasser. I checked my pocket. My fingers tightened around the heavy silver key Julian had given me. My hands weren't shaking anymore. Something had gone completely still inside me, like the moment in preservation work when you strip away the fake, rotted drywall and find the solid, original ironwood beam underneath. They thought they had erased me, but they didn't know that Julian had given me the architecture to tear their entire kingdom down. I turned around, walked down the marble steps, and caught a cab straight to the county probate court. It was time to open the iron box. If you've ever been systematically underestimated by people who thought their money made them untouchable, if you know what it feels like to be locked out of your own life, I want you to comment the word *architect* below. Let me know you're standing with me. The cab ride to the probate court felt like a descent into a completely different kind of silence. The rain was coming down in sheets now, drumming against the roof of the car in a frantic, unyielding rhythm. I didn't cry. The tears had dried on my face, leaving a tight, stinging sensation across my cheeks. I just stared at my reflection in the fogged-up window, my hand pressed firmly against the silver key in my coat pocket. Victoria thought she had orchestrated the perfect corporate execution. She thought that by locking me out of the church, she had successfully severed my connection to the Caldwell name before anyone could ask questions. But she had made a fatal mathematical error. She had assumed that because I was quiet, I was empty. She had assumed that because I didn't speak the language of boardrooms and corporate trusts, I didn't know how to look for the load-bearing walls of a legal fight. I arrived at the probate court building downtown, just as the afternoon light was beginning to flatten into a dull, leaden gray. The building was an imposing granite structure, built in the late 19th century with heavy Doric columns and high ceilings that made every footstep echo like a gavel strike. I badged through security, my boots squeaking softly on the wet marble floor, and made my way straight to the records clerk's office on the 3rd floor. "I need to check the filing status of an estate documentation," I told the clerk behind the glass partition, a tired-looking woman named Brenda who had a stack of manila folders 3 feet high beside her desk. I handed her my ID and the name of the probate attorney Julian had mentioned, Margaret Caldwell. Brenda typed the name into her system, her long fingernails clicking against the keyboard in a steady, metallic rhythm that reminded me of the tickers on a boardroom wall. She stopped, squinted at the screen, and then looked up at me over her reading glasses, her eyebrows rising slightly. "Are you Sarah Caldwell?" she asked, her voice dropping to a lower, more deliberate register. "I am," I said, my voice level and clear. "The will was filed under a confidential escrow account 3 weeks ago by attorney Caldwell," Brenda said, leaning slightly closer to the glass partition. "But the red wax seal can only be broken by a probate judge during an active petition hearing. Your sister-in-law's firm, Caldwell Holdings, LLC, filed an emergency petition for probate administration this morning at 9:00 a.m. They're claiming there is no valid personal will and are moving to have the estate assets absorbed back into the primary corporate trust under intestacy rules. The judge has scheduled an unsealing and standing hearing for tomorrow morning at 10:00 a.m. in courtroom 4B. Is the property at 42 Maple Ridge Court listed in the petition?" I asked, my chest tightening. Brenda scrolled down her screen. "Yes, along with 7 other historical commercial parcels in the North End and South End. Total estimated personal asset value is listed at approximately $14 million. The petition claims the decedent had no legal spouse due to an unfinalized asset integration clause in the family trust bylaws." I leaned my forehead against the cool glass partition for just 2 seconds. $14 million. Julian had never told me the exact numbers. He had always talked about the buildings as structures that needed fixing, as joists that needed reinforcing, as bricks that needed pointing. He had hidden the true scope of his wealth from his family's corporate spreadsheets because he knew that the moment Victoria saw the dollar signs, she would bring out the saws. "Thank you, Brenda," I whispered. I walked out of the court building and caught a bus back to Charlestown. When I reached our street, the rain had backed off to a miserable, cold mist. I walked up the brick steps of our brownstone, my hand trembling just slightly as I turned the brass key in the deadbolt. The lock fell into place with a heavy, familiar click. The house was cold. The heat hadn't been turned on since Saturday, and the air held the faint, lingering scent of linseed oil and the peppermint tea Julian used to drink when his throat was dry. Timber met me at the door, his golden head low, his tail giving 2 slow, hesitant thumps against the pine floor before he rested his chin against my knee. "Hey, boy," I whispered, kneeling on the floor and wrapping my arms around his thick neck. "It's just us now, but we're keeping the house." I went upstairs to the attic. The stairs were narrow and steep, the wood creaking under my weight in a slow, rhythmic progression. The attic was dark, lit only by a small octagonal window that faced the harbor. The air smelled of old wool, dry timber, and historic dust. I moved 3 plastic storage bins out of the corner, stacking them one by one until the original pine floorboards were exposed beneath the massive central collar tie beam we had reinforced with iron straps the previous winter. I knelt on the floor, my fingers tracing the grain of the wood until I found the small, recessed notch Julian had carved near the base of the joist. I pressed the edge of a flathead screwdriver into the seam. The floorboard lifted with a sharp, dry crack, exposing a shallow cavity between the timber joists. Inside sat a small, heavy iron lockbox, painted dark green, with a thick brass padlock that had been cast in a foundry in South Boston 80 years ago. I pulled the tarnished silver key from my coat pocket and slid it into the keyway. The lock was stiff, the internal pins resisting for a fraction of a second before they cleared with a heavy, satisfying clunk asterisk. I lifted the iron lid. Inside sat a cream-colored envelope, heavy stock, sealed with 3 distinct discs of red wax bearing the notary stamp of Margaret Caldwell, attorney at law. Below the seal, written in Julian's elegant, slanted blue ink, were 2 lines. To the probate court of Suffolk County. In the event of my passing, break the seal in the presence of my wife, Sarah. Beneath the envelope lay a black leather ledger, its pages full of handwritten notes, timestamps, and certified copies of property deeds. I opened the ledger to page 1. It wasn't an estate plan. It was an audit. For 3 years, while Victoria had been bragging about her commercial acquisitions in the Seaport district, Julian had been quietly documenting something else. He had been using his position as a non-voting board member of Caldwell Holdings to track the flow of corporate funds. The ledger contained explicit, detailed evidence that Victoria had been leveraging Julian's historic properties to secure high-interest commercial loans for her steel and glass developments, falsifying asset valuation reports to the bank, and treating his personal preservation portfolio as an unbacked credit line for her firm. She didn't want the brownstones because they were crumbling brick heaps. She wanted them because if Julian died and the titles reverted to the corporate estate, the paper trail of her massive, unbacked liabilities would be buried forever beneath the legal architecture of a family inheritance. Wade Caldwell, my father-in-law's younger brother and a senior trustee at the firm, had signed off on 3 of those transfers. I found a copy of a text message thread printed and taped to page 14. It was from Victoria to Wade, dated 2 months prior. Julian's health is failing faster than expected. The bank is demanding a title verification for the Charlestown parcels before the closing date on the Seaport expansion. If Sarah gets standing, the audit will trigger a structural default. We need to finalize the asset integration block before probate gets complicated. Wade's response came 3 minutes later. The family lawyers are holding up the marriage license verification on corporate grounds. She has no footprint. We'll move on the properties the morning after the service. Stay the course. I sat on the cold attic floor for 20 minutes, the ledger open in my lap, the red wax seal of the will catching the faint light from the octagonal window. My hands were cold, but the shaking had stopped entirely. Victoria hadn't just tried to exclude me from a funeral. She had spent 2 years hunting my husband's legacy, treating his declining health as a legal window to cover up a multi-million-dollar corporate fraud. I closed the ledger, placed it back in the box along with the sealed will, and locked the padlock. I stood up, my spine straight, my steps measured as I carried the iron box down the narrow stairs. That night I sat at our kitchen table, the one Julian had sanded until the grain felt like silk under the fingers. I plugged in my laptop and sent a single text message to Victoria's personal cell phone number. No preamble, no anger, no middle-class resentment, just facts. I have the iron box from the attic, Victoria. The court hearing is tomorrow at 10:00 a.m. I'll see you in room 4B. Her reply came in less than 2 minutes. The calculation was immediate. You're playing a dangerous game, Sarah. Forging documents or attempting to disrupt an active corporate probate administration is a felony in this state. If you show up tomorrow with some fake narrative, our lawyers will have you removed from the building in handcuffs. Think about your parents' reputation in Worcester before you make a scene you can't undo. I didn't respond. I turned the phone face down on the table, leaned my head back against the wood, and listened to the rain clear off the harbor. Victoria thought her deadline was the probate hearing tomorrow morning. She thought that because she had the Caldwell name and a team of white-shoe corporate lawyers, she owned the room. But she didn't realize that a structure built on a rotted joist doesn't care how expensive the paint is on the outside. When the weight is applied to the wrong point, the whole framing falls down at once. At 9:30 the next morning, I stood outside courtroom 4B. The courthouse hummed with that specific, sharp energy that legal buildings get before a high-stakes docket. Lawyers in tailored gray suits carried leather folders. Clerks hurried down the corridors with wheeled carts full of files. And in the center of the hallway, sitting rigid, sleepless, and terrified, were my parents. They had driven down from Worcester at dawn after I called them from the kitchen floor. My mother, Denise, was clutching her purse against her side, her face blotched from a night of quiet, worried crying. My dad, Greg, was standing in his only good tweed jacket, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets, looking around the granite corridor with an expression of intense, protective fury. "Sarah, baby," Mom whispered, reaching out to touch my sleeve the moment she saw me. Her hand was warm, smelling faintly of the lavender cream she used after teaching. "The paper's online. They're saying Julian didn't leave a will. They're saying his family is moving to evict you. Is it true?" "They're trying, Mom," I said, leaning down to kiss her cheek. "But they're going to fail." Dad looked at the heavy leather portfolio under my arm, his jaw setting tightly. "That sister of his," I saw her down by the elevators with 4 men in suits. She looked right through us, Sarah, like we were grease spots on the floor. I wanted to. "Don't, Dad." I held his gaze, my voice dropping to that calm, clinical register I had practiced in the dark. "We don't need volume today. We have the architecture." The courtroom doors opened at 9:55 a.m. The room was small, organized, and smelled like old wood and floor wax. Judge Arthur Vance sat at the high walnut bench, his silver hair sharp against his black robes as he reviewed the morning's docket. Victoria entered 40 seconds later. She was a moving empire of confidence. She wore a navy blue power suit, a white silk scarf pinned with a diamond clip, and her gold Cartier bracelet clinked against her watch as she took her place at the petitioner's table. Behind her sat Wade Caldwell, his face a mask of aristocratic boredom, and 3 senior corporate attorneys from a firm whose name was cast in brass on State Street. Victoria didn't look at me. She didn't look at my parents sitting in the second row of the gallery. She sat down, buttoned her jacket with deliberate slowness, and nodded toward her lead attorney, a tall, silver-haired man named Harrington who looked like he had spent his entire life winning arguments in rooms exactly like this one. Judge Vance cleared his throat, the sound sharp as a gavel strike in the quiet room. "Suffolk County Probate Court is now in session for the matter of the estate of Julian Caldwell, case number 2026 PR 8547. We have an emergency petition for probate administration filed by Caldwell Holdings, LLC, and a conflicting appearance notice filed by Sarah Caldwell." He looked over his reading glasses at the tables. "Mr. Harrington, you have the floor for the petitioner." Harrington stood up, smoothing the lapels of his gray suit with a confident, practiced nod. "Thank you, Your Honor. The position of Caldwell Holdings is simple. The decedent, Julian Caldwell, passed away intestate on Thursday morning. While he had a personal relationship with the respondent, Sarah Caldwell, the marriage asset integration was formally blocked under Section 14.3 of the Family Corporate Trust Bylaws due to an unresolved title dispute last year. Legally, the respondent has no standing as a surviving spouse under the estate's current corporate definition. He slid a heavy manila folder across the table toward the clerk. "We have provided the certified trust bylaws, the unfinalized asset integration notice, and a formal request for the immediate transfer of the Charlestown and North End titles back to Caldwell Holdings to protect the corporate credit framework from imminent default. The decedent's sister, Victoria Caldwell, is prepared to accept the role of sole administrator." Victoria allowed herself a small, microscopic nod of agreement, her eyes fixed steadily on the judge. Judge Vance reviewed the papers for 40 seconds, his face completely unreadable. Then he turned his gaze down the room toward me, sitting alone at the respondent's table with nothing but my leather portfolio and a heavy green iron box resting on the wood beside me. "Ms. Caldwell," Judge Vance said, his voice carrying an unexpected structural weight, The petitioner has presented a documented claim that your marriage status did not meet the corporate trust definitions required for estate succession, and that no valid personal will was recorded with the family firm. Do you have documentation to the contrary? I stood up. The room held its breath. I didn't look at Victoria. I didn't look at Harrington. I opened the leather portfolio, pulled out the heavy cream envelope with the 3 unbroken discs of red wax, and held it up to the light of the high courtroom windows. I have the last will and testament of Julian Caldwell. My voice came through the quiet room, clear, level, and entirely devoid of fear. Notarized and executed 3 weeks before his passing by independent counsel outside the city, and I am requesting an immediate unsealing under Probate Rule 7. Victoria's head snapped toward me, her perfect composure cracking for a fraction of a second as she saw the red wax seal. Her hand shot to Harrington's sleeve, her fingers digging into the gray wool with a force that made her knuckles turn white. The silence between us could have cracked glass. I know some of you watching right now are wondering what my sister-in-law did the moment that red wax seal broke under the judge's fingers. If you've ever watched a bully realize they've run out of rooms to hide in, type the word **karma* in the comments right now. Because what happened next in that courtroom is the exact reason you never let anyone tell you that your family doesn't belong at the front table. Judge Vance adjusted his reading glasses and leaned forward over the high walnut bench. "Bring the document forward, Miss Caldwell," he directed, his tone carrying the razor-sharp gravity that only a probate courtroom can hold. I stepped up to the bench, my heels striking the hardwood in a firm, measured rhythm that echoed through the silent room. I handed the heavy cream envelope to the bailiff, who passed it directly to the judge. Victoria watched the document move, her chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. Her gold Cartier bracelet clicked sharply against the wooden table as she shifted her weight, a nervous, jagged motion that entirely betrayed the polished armor she had worn into the court. The judge picked up a silver letter opener. With a single, clean slice, he broke through the 3 red wax discs bearing the notary stamp of Margaret Caldwell. The crisp sound of heavy paper tearing was the only noise in the room. He slid the 3 pages of dense legal text out of the envelope and began reading. The silence stretched for a full minute, 2 minutes, 3. I watched the recognition move through the judge's face like weather. His eyebrows leveled, his jaw tightened, and his eyes rose briefly from the paper to scan the petitioner's table, resting on Victoria and Wade with an expression of cold, judicial evaluation. "This will," Judge Vance began, his voice cutting through the stillness like an iron blade, "was executed on May 24, 2026, properly witnessed by 2 independent notaries, and recorded in an off-site estate escrow. It completely revokes all previous testamentary documents, including any corporate estate clauses outlined by Caldwell Holdings, LLC. Harrington stood up immediately, his hands flat on his table. "Your Honor, we must object, under the family trust bylaws." "Sit down, Mr. Harrington," Judge Vance interrupted. The steel in his voice was non-negotiable. "Your corporate bylaws govern your firm's internal equity distribution, but they do not override the statutory right of an individual to dispose of their personal real property and sole member LLC holdings. And your claim that the respondent has no footprint as a surviving spouse is legally offensive." The judge turned the page, adjusting his glasses. "Article 6, Clause 2, Designation of Sole Beneficiary. I'll read the decedent's exact words into the record." He cleared his throat and began reading Julian's final decree. "I hereby bequeath the entirety of my personal estate, including the titles to the Charlestown brownstone, the 4 historic commercial parcels in the north end, and the 3 preservation tracts in the south end, valued collectively at $14.2 million, solely and completely to my wife, Sarah Caldwell. This bequest is made with full knowledge of my sister Victoria's systematic attempt to leverage my personal portfolio to secure unbacked corporate loans for Caldwell Holdings expansion projects. I have spent 3 years documenting this behavior. Sarah is not a guest in my life. She is the architect of its preservation. I choose her." A sharp, choking sound escaped Victoria's throat. She shot to her feet, her face completely drained of color, her mouth hanging open in total disbelief. The pristine mask of old money dignity she had worn for 36 years didn't just crack, it shattered right onto the courtroom floor. "That's a lie," she shouted, her voice high and brittle, echoing wildly off the granite walls. "He was sick. He wasn't in his right mind when he wrote that. She manipulated him in that house, isolating him from our lawyers." "Victoria, sit down," Wade hissed from behind her, his own aristocratic composure completely failing as his face turned a mottled, furious purple. He grabbed the fabric of her navy blazer, forcefully pulling her back into her chair. "Mr. Harrington," Judge Vance's voice dropped to a dangerous register. "Your petition claimed the decedent died intestate and that the corporate subsidiary had immediate right of repossession over the Charlestown property. It appears your client omitted a massive conflict of interest regarding the financial status of those titles." "Your Honor," Harrington's voice had lost its smooth, State Street polish. It was rough, defensive. "We were acting on the information provided by the corporate board." "I have the backup architecture, Your Honor," I spoke up, my voice calm, level, and entirely devoid of volume. I stepped back to the respondent's table and lifted the lid of the green iron lockbox. I pulled out the black leather ledger Julian had kept hidden beneath the attic floorboards and slid it across the mahogany table toward the court clerk. "This ledger contains certified copies of the bank valuation reports from the last 24 months, I continued, looking directly at the judge, completely ignoring the dawning terror on Victoria's face. "It documents 3 separate instances where Victoria Caldwell used scanned copies of Julian's signature to certify title availability for properties he owned personally, leveraging them against a $6 million line of credit for her seaport development. The text threads taped to page 14 confirm that Wade Caldwell was fully aware the titles were held in Julian's personal name, not the corporate trust. Patterson, the court's independent legal analyst who had been sitting quietly in the corner, stepped up to review the ledger alongside the judge. He turned the pages slowly, his thumb tracing the printed text threads and bank timestamps. After 90 seconds, he looked up at Judge Vance and gave a single definitive nod. "The signatures on the loan verifications match the uniform density of a digital scan, Your Honor," Patterson reported. "The underlying titles have been held exclusively by Julian Caldwell outside the family firm since 2023. The corporate petition is built on a misrepresentation of asset ownership." Judge Vance closed the folder with a heavy, definitive slam that sounded like a cellular door falling into place. "The emergency petition filed by Caldwell Holdings is denied in its entirety," the judge decreed, his eyes fixing on Victoria with absolute finality. "I am formally validating the will presented by Sarah Caldwell. As of this moment, she is the sole executor and majority beneficiary of the personal estate. Furthermore, per probate rule 12, I am referring this ledger and the associated loan document packets to the district attorney's office for immediate white-collar criminal review regarding corporate fraud and forgery." Victoria sat frozen, her hands clutched so tightly around her white silk scarf that her knuckles looked like polished bone. She didn't look at Harrington. She didn't look at Wade. She stared straight ahead at the walnut bench, realizing that the massive real estate empire she had tried to steal hadn't just slipped through her fingers. The paper trail she had spent 2 years trying to bury had just been handed to a prosecutor. Harrington gathered his papers with shaking hands, snapping his Mont Blanc briefcase shut with a sharp, metallic click that signaled the absolute end of his argument. He walked out of courtroom 4B without waiting for his clients, his heels clicking in a hurried, defensive retreat down the granite corridor. Wade stood up next, his jaw locked. He looked down at Victoria, his voice dripping with cold, aristocratic fury. "You said the Worcester girl didn't have the files. You said she was just an administrative error." Victoria didn't answer. She rose slowly, her power suit suddenly looking too big for her, her confidence entirely emptied out. She walked toward the double doors of the courtroom, her steps slow, heavy, and completely ruined. As she reached the threshold, She stopped and turned her head to look at me one final time. Her drugstore makeup had smeared slightly beneath her eyes from the damp mist outside. The sister-in-law who had locked me out of my own husband's memorial service now looked incredibly small, wedged between the heavy oak doors and the exit sign. She opened her mouth, her lips forming the beginning of a sentence, perhaps an excuse, perhaps a plea, but no words came out. I didn't offer her a reaction. I didn't smile, I didn't gloat, and I didn't shout. I just met her gaze with the quiet, structural clarity of a woman who had outlasted the storm. Victoria turned around and walked out into the corridor, disappearing past the elevators. No cameras clicked. No reporters followed her. The silence she had tried to impose on my life had just become her own prison. My dad stood up from the gallery row, his face split by a wide, emotional grin as he wrapped his thick arms around my mother. Mom was crying, but these weren't the worried, sleepless tears from Worcester. These were real tears of validation. "You did it, Sarah," Dad whispered, walking up to the table and pulling me into a hug that smelled of wool and old wood. "You held the joists together." "Julian held them, Dad," I said, pressing my face against his shoulder as the final knot of grief and tension in my chest began to slowly unravel. I just kept the key. 3 weeks later, the structural fallout hit Caldwell Holdings exactly the way Julian's ledger had predicted. The district attorney's office opened a formal investigation into the Seaport credit lines. Faced with the unsealed probate evidence, the regional lender pulled the funding for Victoria's Steel End Glass Tower, triggering an immediate structural default on the corporate subsidiary. Victoria wasn't fired with a press release. That's not how old money firms handle their disasters. She was quietly invited to step down from the board to focus on personal health matters. Her name was removed from the acquisition door on State Street by the end of the month, replaced by a plain bronze plate that didn't hold any history at all. Wade Caldwell resigned 2 weeks later, selling his remaining corporate shares back to the firm at a massive loss to settle his legal liabilities before the formal indictments could be handed down. I didn't celebrate their ruin. I didn't post about it on social media, and I never called a single reporter. I didn't have to. The architecture of their deception had carried its own weight until the foundation gave way on its own. Now, it is July of 2026. The morning sun is coming through the transom window of our Charlestown brownstone, casting that liquid, golden light across the pine floors Julian sanded with his hands. Timber is asleep under my drafting desk, his breathing steady, rhythmic, and perfectly peaceful. On my desk sits the black leather ledger, now closed, alongside a new set of building permits. I didn't sell the historic brownstones. I didn't clear them away for commercial square footage. Next month, we're breaking ground on the Caldwell Preservation Foundation, a nonprofit trade school funded entirely by Julian's estate, designed to teach young people from across New England how to restore old timbers, how to point historic brickwork, and how to look for the structural honesty in the buildings they inherit. My parents are moving down from Worcester next week. Dad is going to manage the tool inventory in the old back bedroom. Mom is already designing the curriculum for the first class of preservation apprentices. We don't have chandeliers or emerald size of cough drops. We have an old house with uneven floors, a garden that smells of rosemary and pine, and a kitchen table where every single person has a seat worth sitting in. If you're watching this and you're currently standing on the pavement in the rain, waiting for the people who hurt you to realize your worth, stop waiting. See your own foundation first. Build your life with the people who actually show up for the structural work, the ones who help you carry the logs when the weather gets cold. And when the others finally turn around and realize what they lost, let them find a door that you control. You decide when it opens. You decide how wide. You decide who walks through. That's not middle-class resentment. That's architecture. My name is Sarah Caldwell. I am 29 years old, a preservationist, a majority shareholder, and I am finally, completely, living a life lived entirely on my own terms.